Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 47 of It's Murder Up North. First of all, I hope you enjoyed listening to the Q&A episode, and thank you to everyone who has entered the competition to win some Murder Up North merchandise and a copy of the novel The Lie She Told. I am very pleased to announce an additional prize in the form of the book titled Yorkshire Ripper, The Secret Murders, which is the true story of how Peter Sutcliffe's terrible reign of terror claimed at least 22 more lives. This has kindly been offered by the wonderful Chris Clark, who is a retired police officer turned author. To be in with a chance of winning, please visit the It's Murder Up North Facebook discussion group, where details are posted. The closing date for entries is the 31st of January. I would like to extend my thanks to Rumpy Bumpy for leaving a wonderful 5-star review for the show. I am glad the podcast gives you something to look forward to each Sunday. And now to my podcast of the week. It is an investigative series called The Shattered Window, which covers the case of Jacqueline de Wallaby over a series of episodes. It delves into the little girl's disappearance from her home in the middle of the night and the devastating aftermath. Created through months of in-depth research using trial documents, archived files, and interviews with those involved, the hosts cover the story with amazing warmth and compassion. And you may recognise their voices, as it is hosted by the wonderful Emily from Morbidology and the equally amazing Eileen, one of the hosts of Crime Labs, both of which are equally excellent shows in their own right. So I guess I should say my podcasts of the week, as I highly recommend you check out Crime Labs, Morbidology, and The Shattered Window. To give you a taste of the series, here is a sneak peek.
The murder of Jacqueline de Wallaby is a tragedy that has puzzled and polarised the minds of those who know it. Over the past 6 months, we've extensively investigated this case, trawling through files, trial transcripts, and archives, and have been conducting interviews with the people who lived through it.
It was a sensational, startling fact that a 7-year-old little girl had shown up missing from a suburban home.
Something like that happening would have never crossed our parents' minds.
The notion that a stranger can slip into a child's bedroom in the middle of the night, completely undetected, is surely a notion that every single parent on this earth fears. But what's even more lamentable is knowing that a child killer is roaming the street, and even more chilling, they could be someone you know.
Hosted by Emily G. Thompson and Eileen McFarlane, this is The Shattered Window.
Now, let's head to the episode. "65 miles north of Paris lies the French city of Amiens, through which the Somme Canal flows. Once home to the author Jules Verne, the city was almost completely decimated during the World Wars, yet it still boasts an impressive array of architecture. And soaring from amidst the crowded buildings is the Amiens Cathedral. The Gothic structure with its flying buttresses and elegant spire dominates the skyline. The western facade of the cathedral is an architectural masterpiece. Adorned with over 700 statues, its true magnificence being hard to define by words alone, so intricate is its design. The lower portions of the facade is dominated by 3 entranceways. These 3 portals are curved alcoves, lined by lifelike statues, and at the centre of each alcove stands a doorway over which resides the likeness for whom the portal was dedicated. The largest portal sits at the centre and bears the image of Jesus upon the throne. To the left is the portal which portrays the finding of the body of Saint Firmin, whose image resides at the centre, and he is reputedly credited with bringing Christianity to the region. The portal to the right is dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It has been determined that the statues that adorn these portals were once decorated with vibrant colours that have faded over the centuries, and this is now recreated by lights at nightfall. Above these portals is the King's Gallery, which depicts rulers of the past, and above this sits an elaborate rose window. The western facade is dominated by its two towers, most notable for the fact that one is shorter than the other. It is not the most famous cathedral in France. That honour goes to Notre Dame in Paris, the design of which closely resembles Amiens. But this cathedral is twice as large as its more famous counterpart, and due to its architectural and historical importance, the building was recognised as a UNESCO Heritage Site in 1981. In 2020, the cathedral celebrated its 800th anniversary. During the centuries, it has been witness to many key moments in history, from the French Revolution to both World Wars, and it attracts thousands of tourists and pilgrims each year. On the 29th of September 1986, a guided tour was underway. The tour guide was stopping regularly to describe significant facts, and as the tour came to an end, a man handed a note to a member of staff before slipping away from the group and ascending the shorter of the two towers on the western facade. 200 feet above the grand entrances, he climbed over the parapet and clung onto the stonework, as people scurried about below, unaware of his presence. The man intended to end his life. His palms were sweating, his heart racing, and the ground seemed to swirl as he tried not to look down. Slowly people on the ground began to notice the man, clinging precariously above them, and they watched in shock and horror as the tiny figure hesitated. As spectators gathered below, the member of staff to whom the man had handed the note unfolded the white paper to find a handwritten letter, which detailed the man's intentions to end his own life. With this, the member of staff found the image of a dark-haired woman with two young children. In haste, the alarm was raised, and 2 police officers quickly responded and made their way up the 300 steps to the top of the tower, where they were faced with the man clinging precariously onto the wall of the tower. News of the man's presence quickly spread, and more people began to gather below as the officers attempted to coax the man back over the wall. The man refused, insisting he needed to speak to a priest, as he had a confession to make. While the priest was called upon, the negotiations continued, during which the man was identified as a British citizen, who was wanted by South Yorkshire Police, and so the British consulate was brought in to assist in the negotiations. For 7 hours, the man remained on the parapet, with a crowd of tourists gathering in the square below, accompanied by various media outlets and locals, all stunned at the spectacle above them. It took the efforts of the fire brigade, the police, the consulate officials, the city mayor and the priest to convince the man to climb back over the parapet, at which point he was arrested and escorted back down the 300 steps of the tower, brought out through the grand entrance of the western facade. A crowd of hundreds of people observed the man being escorted away. The news travelled quickly across the channel that Ian Wood had been apprehended by French police in the city of Amiens, where he was held without charge while extradition proceedings began. While the wanted man awaited his return to the UK, he was allowed a visit by his family, in whom he had confided that he had intended to end his own life, but because he did not have any drugs or weapons, he considered a number of tall buildings before settling on the cathedral. He alleged that he gave up on this plan when he saw the crowds that had gathered and the television cameras, admitting that he did not want his loved ones to see him plummet to his death. He advised his family that he was not going to fight his extradition back to the UK. However, he did intend to tell the truth about the events that had driven him to the top of the cathedral, and dispel all the lies that had appeared in the newspapers. After spending nearly 7 weeks in a French jail, Ian Wood was flown back to the UK to face prosecution on 2 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of theft. The defendant, Ian Wood, came from a privileged background. His parents had gone to great efforts to ensure he had the best start in life, receiving a private school education, which allowed him to pursue a career in the legal profession. By the age of 30, he was married with 3 children and ran a successful law firm, and he was a well-respected member of the Law Society, acting as a secretary for the Sheffield area, as well as being entrusted as a clerk with the local tax commission. With his wealth and success came his ability to enjoy life. He would regularly host lavish parties and enjoyed 5-star hotels. But his marriage with his wife Margaret floundered, and the couple had begun divorce proceedings. By the beginning of 1986, the couple had separated, and Margaret and the children had moved out of the 18-bedroom home on the outskirts of Sheffield. Within a few months, Ian's 37-year-old girlfriend Danielle and her 2 children, 5-year-old Christopher and 3-year-old Stephanie, had moved into the house in the picturesque countryside of South Yorkshire. Having recently learned that they were expecting their first child together, Ian and Danielle were eager to make a fresh start at Ughill House. Both had separated from their significant others and were going through divorce proceedings, but with a new baby on the way, they were focusing on the future. The home was built of grey stone and sat in the rolling countryside, 7 miles away from the city of Sheffield. Accessed by narrow country roads lined by rustic dry stone walls, beyond which cattle, sheep and horses grazed on the ample green grass. It was an idyllic setting, the fresh air and open countryside perfect for the children to explore and grow. There was an air of contentment when the family first moved into the property. The children would be heard playing in the courtyard outside, their giggles echoing about the hillsides, enjoying the long days of summer sunshine, which by September the 21st, 1986, had faded into rain and blustery wind that swept across the grass, and dark clouds stole the sunlight. Danielle had returned home with Stephanie, delighted with her purchases of items for the new baby, and after she settled her children to bed, the 37-year-old headed to the children's playroom to tidy the toys away. As the warm light of the nursery flickered, darkness descended, and the rain continued to drum on the slate roof. The window frames rattled in the wind, the hills and fields shrouded in darkness, as the old building creaked and groaned in the gloom. The clock in the hallway chimed midnight, and a loud bang erupted through the home. Ian Wood stood in the children's playroom, the gun in his hand still aimed at the chair where the lifeless body of Danielle lay, killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. He then turned his attention to 3-year-old Stephanie, who had sleepily walked towards the sound. Ian told the little girl to go and hide, and he would come and find her. When he located the toddler in her older brother's bedroom, he proceeded to shoot her twice in the head. At this point, Christopher must have been wide awake and terrified, as the silhouette of his mother's boyfriend loomed over the 5-year-old. Ian took the frightened boy into the bathroom, instructed the youngster to close his eyes, and pulled the trigger twice. Despite shooting the little boy, who lay severely wounded on the floor, his assailant proceeded to beat Christopher about the head numerous times with a towel rail. Then he throttled the tiny child with his bare hands until the boy stopped struggling. Having massacred his girlfriend, their unborn baby, and the 2 children, Ian Wood calmly made his way to the master bedroom, where he proceeded to change his clothing, pack his bag, and then head downstairs with his cases. He placed the murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, on the kitchen counter and left the house in darkness. The police would later discover that there was 1 remaining bullet left in the chamber of the gun. Danielle, who was 10 weeks pregnant, Christopher and Stephanie lay undiscovered until the evening of the 22nd of September 1986. When police officers investigating a call from a man claiming the occupants of Ughill Farm were deceased. Upon responding to the remote farmhouse, officers had to force entry to the property when they received no answers to their knocking. Woods had taken the time to ensure that all points of access were secured, leaving the officers no choice but to break down the front door. Once inside the property, police were confronted with the bodies of Danielle and her 2 children, all separated from each other. Danielle was found lying in the far corner of the playroom in a chair. The detective who found her stated later that she was obviously dead. The officer then described finding Stephanie's body. He explained, "In a child's bedroom, I saw the bed to be blood-stained and splashes of blood on a wardrobe door. A blue floral quilt was on the floor. On lifting that, I found the body of Stephanie lying close to the bed. Her head and shoulders were heavily blood-stained." In a bathroom, 5-year-old Christopher was found in a pool of blood, with a bullet wound to his head. The officer said, quote, "He was obviously severely injured and in distress, trying to lift himself onto his right elbow. Amazingly, Christopher had clung to life, despite being shot twice in the head, beaten and strangled. He then lay undiscovered on a cold bathroom floor for 21 hours. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, where the 5-year-old boy's condition was deemed critical, and doctors thought to save his life. Christopher was placed on the intensive care ward, with a life support machine assisting his breathing. Doctors feared that if the little boy survived, he would have permanent loss of eyesight and hearing. The little boy's head bandaged, his face bruised and eyes swollen. He lingered in a comatose state, without his mother to comfort him. The caller who had alerted police to the bodies was Ian Wood, and an urgent appeal was made directly to him to stop running and hand himself in. During the appeal, he was branded as a danger to the public, and people were warned to not approach him should they encounter him. Unsure where the suspect would flee to, the decision was made to place those known to the gunman in protective custody while he remained at large. This included the houses of 4 acquaintances and the home of his ex-wife and their 3 children, as well as the home of Danielle's ex-husband. Police held a press conference on the 23rd of September in which they reported that they had officially issued an arrest warrant for Ian Wood, along with details of the vehicle he was believed to be travelling in. During this press conference, Ian's brother pleaded for him to hand himself in. However, the press conference was interrupted by the fugitive, who made a number of phone calls in which he would only speak to Brenda Tooney, who worked as a reporter for the Sheffield Weekly Gazette. During their conversations, Woods insisted he just wanted to tell her what really happened. But he refused to tell the reporter where he was, and after numerous calls, Woods fell silent, and for 2 days police were no closer to learning the suspect's location. Over this time, they feared they may never find him, and that he may have ended his own life. The case would head in a new direction when on the 25th of September the police received a tip from the Automobile Association, where a receptionist had dealt with a man who matched Wood's description. During their interactions, he had requested an international driving licence. Police had become aware that Woods had a link to France and was actually fluent in the French language. With this information combined with the report from the receptionist, it immediately raised concerns for the police, who had been focusing their search primarily on the Yorkshire region. But the suggestion that Woods may have fled the country led them to notify Interpol. As the search for Ian Woods was extended internationally on the 26th of September, the wanted man contacted Brenda Tooney, but once again he was still unwilling to disclose his location, and he would call her again the following day. This time he wanted to discuss the plans for Danielle and Stephanie's funerals. This conversation was split over 4 separate phone calls. Increasingly concerned for Wood's mental state, police brought in a psychiatrist to help them in the handling of the case, while they continued to hunt for their suspect. They were aware that Woods had seemed to have formed a connection with Brenda Tooney, and with her cooperation they were able to monitor calls made by Wood to the reporter. However, they deemed it too expensive to try and trace the calls. On the 28th of September, 7 days after he had attacked his family, Woods called Tooney 3 times. each call suggesting that he was becoming increasingly unstable, and he began talking about taking his own life. He began opening up to the reporter, not only disclosing his suicidal tendencies, but claiming that he killed them out of, quote, love and desperation, not anger and hate. It would later emerge that Wood would also contact Danielle's parents on that day. However, they refused to disclose exactly what was discussed. Despite his growing trust between Tunie and Woods, the latter still refused to tell her where he was, and he rejected any suggestions of giving himself up. The hunt for the suspect came to a dramatic end on the 29th of September at the top of the tower of Amiens Cathedral, where Ian Wood clung to the wall of the parapet, balancing precariously above the city of Amiens. This city had a connection to the lives he had taken. It was the birthplace of Danielle Ledez, and she had grown up in a village roughly 3 miles away from the cathedral. Sadly, I am unable to find much information on Danielle, save for the fact that at the time she had begun her relationship with Woods, she was working in England as a French teacher and was recently divorced. What drove Ian Woods to head to her birthplace is still disputed. Some may speculate that he planned to visit her parents, or he wanted to be in a place connected to Danielle. But his final actions prior to being arrested created a spectacle in the ancient city, which some argue was just a ruse as part of his defence. When he was escorted back down from the tower, Woods was extradited back to the UK to face prosecution for the murders of Danielle Ledez and her 3-year-old daughter Stephanie, and for the attempted murder of 5-year-old Christopher, who was still clinging to life in intensive care. Prior to his trial, Wood had a committal hearing, in which the charges were detailed. He was to face 2 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and an additional charge of theft for stealing up to £150,000 from his clients. During this preliminary hearing, he pleaded guilty to the charges related to the death of Stephanie and the attempted murder of Christopher. He also admitted to the theft of his client's money. However, when it came to the death of Danielle, his girlfriend, who had been 10 weeks pregnant with his child, Woods refused to accept responsibility. He insisted that they had entered into a suicide pact, and therefore the defence argued that he should be charged with manslaughter. But this suggestion was rejected, and with Woods maintaining he was not guilty of Danielle's murder, the case was sent to trial. In July 1986, the trial of Ian Wood commenced at Sheffield Crown Court. During proceedings, the court heard how Woods had carried out the attack on the family on September the 21st, 1986. His actions were described to the jury, his callous shooting of 2 children, and according to the prosecution, his murder of Danielle Ledez and her unborn child. The defence contested this accusation, presenting the argument that Danielle had died as part of a suicide pact and referenced the Homicide Act 1957, which states, "A person acting in pursuance of a suicide pact between him and another who kills the other, or is a party to the other being killed by a third person, is guilty of manslaughter and not murder." The caveat to this, however, is that the onus is on the defence to prove that the death was as a result of a mutual agreement, in which the defendant at the time of the killing had intended to take their own life as well. To assist in proving this was the case, the defence provided details of the arrangements between Woods and Danielle. According to Ian, he had agreed to carry out a number of actions before taking his own life, and that following their deaths, he had started to undertake these tasks. He had agreed that he would travel to France and visit a church where he would light candles for Danielle, Stephanie, Christopher, and his unborn child. He then intended to notify the press of what had happened to the family and why. Part of the pact he claimed to have with Danielle was that he would carry out the murder of her ex-husband. He also alleged that he wanted to ensure that his girlfriend and her children were buried in the village where Danielle grew up, and that upon their bodies being laid to rest, that he would visit them and place flowers on their graves. To substantiate this suicide pact claim, Barbara Wood, the mother of the defendant, was called to testify. She told the court that Danielle had been depressed for some time, and the source of her despair came from Danielle's relationship with her estranged husband, Colin Lloyd. Mrs. Wood proceeded to explain that between February and May of 1986, on no fewer than 10 occasions had Danielle made statements to her regarding ending her own life, and that on 2 occasions her son's girlfriend had threatened that she would kill her own children before taking her own life. The defendant's mother continued, quote, "I have never seen such sadness and depression. She said there was no point in living. Colin would not leave her alone. I talked with her for hours to try to convince her that Ian would take care of her." 2 days after the shooting, Mrs. Woods recalled that her son had rang her from France. During the conversation, Ian told her that he was acting on a plan agreed with Danielle, and that he wanted to complete his lover's final wishes before ending his own life. She repeated the call to the jury, quote, "He rang me to say goodbye, to say he loved me, and how sorry he was. He was saying there had been a suicide pact." Mrs. Wood's testimony was called into question by statements made by witnesses for the prosecution. Amongst these were 2 of Danielle's friends, her doctor, and her mother. Mrs. Francois Koch had known Danielle for 4 years, and advised the jury, quote, "It is my opinion she was very pleased at being pregnant, and that the pregnancy had been planned by her and Ian to cement their relationship." Another friend, Christine Alston, told the court, "It is my honest opinion she loved her children and would do nothing to harm them, and that she loved life." Danielle's GP, Dr. William Purcell, also testified that Danielle seemed to be very content and gave him no cause for concern regarding her mental state. And Danielle's mother received a telephone call just hours before her daughter's death, during which she had no reason to believe that her daughter was suicidal, and her mother recalled that she seemed very happy during the conversation. The most compelling evidence came from the defendant's own words, via recorded confession Ian Wood had sent to a coroner in Sheffield while he was wanted by the police. As the 30-minute-long recording was played to the court, those gathered fell silent, and Ian Woods became visibly distressed by its contents, in which he provided information on why and how he had carried out the killings, and that his intentions was to ultimately end his own life as well. During the recording, he spoke of how he and Danielle had become overwhelmed by the issues they were facing. She was struggling to cope with her problems regarding her estranged husband, and Ian admitted that he had found himself in financial difficulties, and he had resorted to stealing money from his clients to stave off bankruptcy. At the time of the shootings, Ian Wood claimed he only owned 1 suit, and that his house and car were rented, implying that he had nothing to his name. Following this discussion, he claimed that they had decided they only had one choice, quote, "We all died together. We decided to do it that night when the children were asleep. Danielle and I went upstairs, and we made love for the last time. There was a pile of ironing that needed doing, and although it may sound ridiculous, I sat and talked to her while she did it. I think it was because it was something to do." He proceeded to describe how he and Danielle went hand in hand to the playroom, where she sat down in a chair in front of him. He then continued to state, "We told each other we loved each other. She put her hands up to the side of her head to cover her ears. I went to get the revolver. I picked it up and walked back to just behind Danielle. I don't think she heard me or even knew I was there. I shot her through a cushion. I wanted to make it so I couldn't see the bullet hit her." The defendant then went on to describe how he turned his attention to the children. First of all, 3-year-old Stephanie, whom he claimed he told to go and hide, and he would come and find her. He then told the jury how he believed he shot the little girl 3 times. As the tape continued to play, Ian Wood is heard describing how he told 5-year-old Christopher that he had a surprise for him, and he instructed the boy to lie down on the bathroom floor and close his eyes. Wood then described placing a towel over Christopher's head before shooting the boy twice. He initially believed he had killed the child with these 2 shots, but was startled when the little boy began to groan in pain Wood stated that he couldn't bring himself to shoot the boy again, and proceeded to describe what he did next. Quote, "I picked up a piece of wood. I hit him so hard it broke. It was awful." At no point during this confession did he admit that he also strangled Christopher. Trying to justify his actions, Woods is heard on the recording stating, "Danielle and I were driven to this impasse by an absolutely implacable hatred, namely that of her husband. We agreed what had to be done, and I did it. It was the most appalling thing, and has haunted me ever since. My only fear being that God will not allow me to be with the woman who I love, a woman he described as a beautiful woman devoted to her children." The prosecution pointed out that following the shootings, Woods had changed his clothing, packed a bag, left the gun on the kitchen counter, and left the house, ensuring that all the doors were locked. He then went to the pub, before proceeding to travel to Dover, where he caught a ferry to France, the prosecution implying that these were the actions of a perfectly sane man. The jury was also reminded that the bodies lay undiscovered for nearly 24 hours before Ian had notified the police, suggesting that he did this to give himself time to flee the country. They also called into question Wood's state of mind at the time of the killings, by calling Alan Wales to testify. As the defendant's doctor, he advised that he had previously prescribed Wood with antidepressants on the 11th of November 1985, after his wife and children had left him. The doctor also advised that due to the fact that Woods held a firearms licence, he had notified the police that Ian Wood was suffering from acute emotional stress, and as a precaution, the firearms were removed from him by the police. In December 1985, Ian Wood was handed back his gun collection, following an assessment by a doctor who deemed him to be sound of mind, only for it to be confiscated a couple of months before the shootings. This time his firearms certificate was due to expire, and he had not begun the renewal process in time. However, upon the new licence being issued, Ian's guns were returned to him, having passed another psychological review. In total, he held 8 shotguns, a flintlock pistol, and the .38 caliber revolver, which had once belonged to his father. This particular gun was not only the weapon used to shoot Danielle, Stephanie and Christopher, but it had also been used by Ian's father 3 years earlier to end his own life. On the 30th of July 1987, the prosecution and defence presented their closing arguments to the jury. Mr. Geoffrey Rivlin, on behalf of the prosecution, recapped the events of the 21st of September 1986, reminding the court that Wood had shot and killed 37-year-old Danielle, who was 10 weeks pregnant at the time, in the playroom of their home. He then coerced 3-year-old Stephanie into a game of hide-and-seek, before killing her in her bedroom. 5-year-old Christopher was shot twice in the head, and yet, when that failed to kill the little boy, the defendant proceeded to beat the child over the head with a wooden towel rail, with such force that the piece of wood snapped. The prosecutor continued to detail the elaborate charade which Ian Wood undertook following the shootings, in which he fled from the scene, travelled to France, and while evading the police he made multiple calls to family, acquaintances and a journalist. It was argued by Rivlin that Wood's threat to commit suicide while at Amiens Cathedral was purely for show and the defendant had no intention of acting on his threat, suggesting that he did this just to disguise his true motive, summarising that Wood, quote, killed out of his obsessive hatred, not love. The prosecutor alluded to the suggestion that Ian was in financial difficulties and had become very angry at Danielle for spending £200 on baby clothes. It was also speculated that he despised her children, in particular Christopher, whom he had allegedly referred to as a little brat. Mr. Rivlin then explained that Wood claimed he had entered into a suicide pact with Danielle, which the prosecution argued was not the truth. Addressing the jury, Mr. Rivlin stated, "He claims, however, that he shot her, but that he should not be convicted of her murder, because when he shot her he did so as a result of an agreement between him and Danielle, that he should first shoot her and the children and then kill himself. By law, a person who killed another in such a pact, but survived themselves, should be convicted of manslaughter. But it is only if there is a genuine suicide pact. Where one person has killed another, it is for him to show, if he so wishes, that there was a genuine suicide pact. The prosecution is at an obvious disadvantage in this case. Danielle is dead, and you only have the defendant's words as to the circumstances of these killings. In our submission, Danielle's absence need not deter you from finding the verdict of guilty in this case." End quote. To counter the prosecution's argument, Gilbert Gray made a closing statement for the defence. He told the court that his client had no reason to lie about the suicide pact. After all, he had confessed to the murder of Stephanie and attempted murder of Christopher, which would result in him serving a life sentence anyway. The defence also asked the jury to consider what other motive the defendant would have to take the lives of the children and their mother, other than a suicide pact. Addressing the jury, he stated, "What you have heard in this case must create horror and perhaps indignation in the minds of ordinary, reasonable people. You could be understood for thinking he must be mad. What an extraordinary story. He cannot have been balanced in his mind. You cannot take a cold, clinical clockmaker's approach when you are dealing with the balance of the mind of man or woman, but it is important to put emotions like that aside. Don't allow yourself to be swayed by feelings of revulsion." End quote. Prior to sending the jury to deliberate, Judge Justice Taylor reminded them, quote, "Wood must prove two things. That more probable than not, that he and Danielle agreed that both of them should die, and that it is more probable than not that when he killed them he had settled a firm intention of dying himself in pursuance of the agreement. The jury would also have to consider whether Wood was being honest about his suicide pact against the background of his dishonesty over stealing money from clients." End quote. When the jury returned from deliberation, they revealed that they had found the defendant, Ian Wood, guilty of the murder of Daniel Ledez. And prior to sentencing, Mr. Justice Taylor told the defendant, "You stand before this court guilty of as grave and brutal charges as could be laid." Ian Wood was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murders of Danielle and Stephanie. He was also sentenced to 12 years for the attempted murder of 5-year-old Christopher, and an additional 3 years for the theft of £85,000 of his client's money. The sentence for the attempted murder and for theft were to run concurrently with his life sentence. 6-year-old Christopher spent months in hospital, with doctors believing that he had suffered permanent damage to his hearing and eyesight. But the little boy made a miraculous recovery that astounded medical professionals. His recovery was described by Detective Chief Superintendent Robin Herold, head of South Yorkshire CID, as a medical marvel. No one gave him a cat-in-hell's chance. It's nothing short of a miracle. Upon leaving hospital, having lost his mother and sister, Christopher went to live with his father. He returned to school, and his father explained the ordeal his son has gone through. Quote, "He had operation after operation, only his bravery saw him through." Although Christopher's physical wounds may have healed, the mental scars must still remain. The loss of his mother and sister in such a violent and brutal manner, and the attack upon his own person, must still haunt him to this day. Thank you for joining me for episode 47 of It's Murder Up North. Episode 38 will be available next week. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.